All right, did you get that notification recording in progress?
Yeah, I did.
All right, so I'll just kind of have a little introduction. So this is our final project. My name has been Hudson, and I'm working with Hassan, and we're gonna discuss race, poverty, and the war on drugs. So Hassan, I guess if you want to ask me some questions about it, then I can ask you some questions about it.
All right, I got one question. What are some challenges people face here that outsiders might not see when it comes to poverty?
By outsiders, do you mean like people who don't live in the US or like the more privileged who haven't been affected by poverty?
Basically like the more privileged, the people who are like I would say upper class.
Yeah, I think like since we've talked about social problems this whole semester, all these social problems have never had just one defining factor. Like race can affect poverty, drugs can affect poverty. Like the more impoverished people, more likely to get into drugs statistically. And so like the more privileged people, those who are wealthier and haven't experienced this, will not like most of them just view like I don't want to like make assumptions, but like most wealthy people view poverty as like a thing like, oh, just get a job, go get out of it, and like but there's deeper social factors that we've talked about, such as like healthcare related things. Like the wealthier are going to have more access to that. They have more benefits when it comes to that. So those who are impoverished, yes, it can be you can just go get a job, but like it's a cycle oftentimes that's hard to break out of. And like it's not just being poor. That's the main factor of poverty. It's not just not having money. It's about the bigger social factors that affect that and things that have gone into I guess, plaguing people with poverty. And like there are people who like are impoverished because of their own choices. They don't choose to try their hardest. But then there are people who do try. They go out and work hard every day, and it's just a cycle that's really hard to break out of. So that's what I would say to that.
Yeah, I was actually gonna add on to that. Sometimes there are people who do have jobs, but they don't actually like make enough to fully like support their families or get like what they need.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. I'll give you a question now. So we're discussing race, poverty, and drugs. So how do you think poverty and drugs might be related to one another?
So, obviously, most people would resort. I feel like this is my personal opinion. I'm not like trying to say this is 100% true, but I feel like most people who do resort to, distributing and selling drugs are often in need of the money. Like, for example, someone has a treatment that they can't pay for, or so they have to basically try and make as much money as quickly as possible. I also think that there are people who do come from poor backgrounds or who grew up poor, and this is basically like, I guess, the lifestyle they grew up with, and it's sort of been like something that they have to adapt to as well, which is why I feel like most people who are involved in that kind of lifestyle often are carrying weapons and stuff that can basically just protect them from any kind of harm uh, because they know how dangerous the world like really is, and they know exactly what it is they're doing. So they're ensuring their own safety by constantly carrying around weapons.
Yeah, and I'll add on to that a little. Like, it's not like it's just only poor people who are doing these drugs. Like, the drug module wasn't too long ago, and it talked about how, like, in the South Bronx, like, that's kind of just been an area defined by like drugs, but like, it's often like richer, wealthier people sometimes, and they just have lower people who are like, will do almost anything they need to get money to get out of poverty because it's just like the feeling of like you're stuck in that cycle and you just have to do whatever you can to get out. So that's what I'd add to that. But yeah, I totally agree with what you were saying about that.
All right, I'm gonna ask you another question. How
All right.
does how does drug violence affect families and young people here?
So how does drug violence affect families and young people here? I've personally never been like my family has never been involved with drugs. We've never really known. like close relatives have been involved in drugs. But I mentioned in my video for the war on drugs about how I've had coworkers who've talked about their battle with drugs and how it can't like it's obviously one of the major addictions that we have in the US. I don't want to know like in detail specifically about young children, but like it's definitely one of the lead factors that tears families apart. Like oftentimes if there's not like a dominant like necessarily like it doesn't have to be a father, but like a lead figure in the house, like it can be easy for like a child or like a minor to slip into selling drugs to using drugs to abusing them. And I just feel like the war on drugs has like grown into like it's not just like oh people just sell them to one another, but like it affects families. Like part of the reason some families are impoverished is because like the parents spend all their money on drugs, and that affects the kids who really don't can't control that. So that's what I would say on that, how like poverty and like the drugs, like people like the kids who really don't have a say over it are affected heavily by the choice of the parents who are impoverished because they're addicted to drugs and they don't seek the help they need or they don't attempt or try to get help to break out of the cycle. So that's what I would say to that.
All right,
All right, I have another question for you.
go ahead.
Um, so we talked about how you think so since we're talking about race, drugs, and poverty, we haven't really discussed race yet. How do you think race affects either drugs, like how do race and drugs mix, or how do race and poverty mix? Like, how do they affect and go off of one another?
So you're basically asking like what connection there is between race and drugs.
Yeah, race and drugs or race and poverty. You can choose which one you want to talk about.
So obviously, like we've seen in the past, where people of color are constantly like getting blamed for crimes that they didn't commit, and I feel like drugs are no different. You know, usually, uh, if someone is caught with drugs or there's like drugs in the area, usually um the judicial system or people who are accusing others would normally default to a person of color rather than, oh, say a white person, because I feel like they just are going off stereotypes instead of, actually knowing who the person is. For all we know, that person had probably no involvement whatsoever, yet they're just going off of a stereotype instead of choosing to believe what actually happened or doing some, like digging of their own and finding out the truth.
Yeah, I feel like we can be so quick to assume, like, because I'm mixed raced and I have family who are both black and white, I've seen like both sides of that. My grandparents live in like not like they live in like North Nashville, but not in, like the best part. And like the majority of the population there is black. And so like people would like if you're like and it's like if you were going to like a rich neighborhood with mostly white people, if you were to find like ask like, hey, where do mostly drugs happen? Like like just by default, like not necessarily on fault, like there's de like not everybody there is definitely doing drugs. There probably are some people, but the majority probably aren't. So I feel like what this class is like trying to point us at and teach us is like the greater social problems and how like we can't just assume and judge everybody because of one stereotype because it would be a whole lot worse if everybody in one area, like let's say like one sketchy area, like there's just all black people or all people of different races who weren't white. Because people like really don't associate white people with drugs often. But like they're white people are just as likely, but often it's the area that stereotypes the people like, oh, this is a sketchy, poor looking area. All these people are doing drugs when that's all on like honestly probably not the case. Like the majority of people are not just doing drugs. So I feel like we just something that's something we need to be careful for.
All right. Well, since we brought up stereotypes, I was gonna ask, what stereotypes or misconceptions do you think need to be challenged?
I think definitely in like the recent political landscape, especially with like, at the like the border of Mexico and like the drugs the cartels in Mexico and the drug problem that the America has, I feel like people are so quick to want to just deport everybody back across the border. And yes, they're coming over here legally, but there are humane systems that we have in place to do that. So I feel like we just got to be careful about if there is like an immigrant in the country, we need to be careful about assuming, oh, they're just here doing no good, they're here doing drugs, when they're probably just trying to here to come for a better life. And even though if they are doing that, they need to do it by legal means, and we need to be accepting of that. We don't just need to want to ship everybody back. We want to be humane about it. We want people to have the privileges of this country, but under a controlled, humane, legal setting. And we just need to be careful about stereotyping everybody because if you think about one of the things about Mexico's political landscape, it's like the cartels. That's what most people would think about. And like every immigrant who comes from the south border of the US is not here trying to do drugs. So I feel like it's just a stereotype that we got to be careful about. We shouldn't be so like quick to judge and assume, but want to help them in a humane, legal way. So that's what I would say about that. One of the stereotypes that we need to be careful about.
I actually would like to add another like stereotype. As you remember, like a couple years back with the whole BLM riot with the death of George Floyd, and now he was tragically killed
Yeah.
by a police officer. And when the information came out, it turned out that George Floyd was actually innocent, and that the police officer who took his life basically had assumed that he was outside doing bad things when in fact none of that was true. Like, this is something that it's not like new to the US. It's been happening for hundreds of years back then, especially during slavery. But basically, this is like a common problem even in today's world, where just because we're not seeing it happen as like as much on the news, I feel like people don't actually realize that it's happening. And I remember actually there were people who um during it was like a certain on I don't remember exactly what the channel was called, but basically there were white people who were responding by saying white lives matter, or basically against the whole BLM riot, which I honestly don't understand it. I don't know why they did it in the first place. But clearly I I'm I'm just confused by it.
Yeah, I'll have a couple of comments about that, because well, what was I about to say? So like that right is like it's kind of just a thing where like we're so quick to assume like especially with like obviously different races, like racism is like we I feel like we have almost have this idea or idea that racism is no longer a thing. Like when we think of racism in the US, we obviously think back to like the 1800s and slavery and stuff. But like racism is still a pretty prevalent topic. Yes, more people are like it's obvious like there's so many different races that are in the same job and the same workforce and like they have no problem getting along with each other. But just like I don't think racism anymore is really like towards one specific like one person like oh like let's say a neighborhood is majority right white, excuse me, and like there's one neighbor who's black. Like that's not really how we look at racism anymore. It's more like towards groups. So I feel like more groups are targeted instead of just like individual people. Like oh, like people in this town, like oh, we don't like blacks here. Like that's not how I feel like racism is anymore. I feel like it's more like just like played at like on social media, like if you're on Instagram or there's reels about like not really racism, but like hinting at jokes and stuff. I feel like racism is more turned into like this kind of like jokish, kind of like stereotypical thing. And what you were talking about, like all lives matter. And so like I understand what the Black Lives Matter is for, but like for the whites to just be in there like, oh, like hinting at them like, oh, see, y'all are just causing trouble. Our lives really matter. I just feel like that's placing unnecessary stereotypes on that. Like, and I'm like I don't remember, but like I doubt it was a black officer that did what he did to that man. So like it's just like, you know, we got to be careful what we assume and who we judge and what conditions we place things under.
Yeah.
Well, that's honestly all the questions I had. We discussed race, drugs, poverty. I really enjoyed this class. Thank you to Dr. Solomon for providing us with all these materials and the resources to explore the social problems, to broaden our minds to the ideas that have been affecting the U.S. and are continuing to affect the U.S., and to better prepare us for discussions with other people about how I can go about talking about these in a civilized, respectful way.
Yeah, I was gonna say, yeah, this class has definitely taught me a lot, not just about social problems, but what actually really goes on in the world, like how many problems there really are out here that we don't even realize.
Yeah. Anyway, thank you, Hassan, for working with me.
I appreciate it.
Yeah. Take care, man.
You too. Have a good one.
You too.